So when a child's identity is false, not true, very narrow, they're not thinking about their intellectual identity, their emotional identity, their spiritual identity. They're just thinking about, I want to be a boy. It limits their belonging. It'll rob them of purpose, and it will change what they value for their competence.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, an estimated 71% of kids who identify as LGBTQ, that's including 86% of kids who kind of identify as transgender and non-binary. They say that laws impacting those who identify as LGBTQ have had a negative impact on their mental health. Nearly half of kids who are wrestling through LGBTQ challenges considered suicide in the previous year. That was according to a recent 2022 survey. Given the seeming large number of people who are young, who are identifying as LGBTQ, that's about 25% of high school students who are reported saying that they're not heterosexual in some studies. Those surveys are important because it shows kind of a growing number of kids who are wrestling through this gender identity issue. But many are saying that there's actually little research that's been done that's focusing on the experiences of parents. Many parents have lost connection with their child who's wrestling through gender identity, and people are stepping in, kind of helping out kids who are experiencing gender confusion by maybe causing kids to explore or question their gender. You know, there's a psychologist out of the University of Florida. His name's Roberto Abreu, and he says that parents can experience really a gamut of emotions after their kids announce that they're really questioning their own gender. And these emotions can be things like shock, confusion, sadness, worry, guilt, fear, grief, anger. All of that really is emerging from parents. And it can take sometimes 2 years or more for those emotions to abate, according to Abreu. He says that parents often feel overwhelmed by the disconnect between their earlier beliefs about their child's identity and what their child is now telling them now is their identity. And this burden is enhanced as parents now are working to navigate kind of schools, especially with pronouns and walking through the kid's new identity and making sure the school kind of falls in line with it. But then there's also things like healthcare and other governmental systems that really are there to kind of support the parent, but maybe not support the parent, support the child. And it's adding strain now on these relationships. So Dr. Kathy, I have to note this kind of as we start this conversation. Many countries around the world are really halting so-called gender reassignment surgeries and even encouraging quote unquote gender transition treatments for all people. That's for kids and adults alike. And this is really kind of causing some to really ask big questions of the U.S., which is running really kind of haphazardly into this whole fray to encourage kids to reinforce their questioning of their own gender. Is there a problem? And if so, what is the greatest challenge then for kids when we encourage them to question their gender identity and kind of place it before them as this is normal, and they can really build their own gender identity as, you know, an adolescent who's starting to understand the world? Is that a problem? And if so, what really is then the greatest challenge that kids face with that?
It is a problem, yes. And I'm glad you're pointing out that some of the countries that began allowing people to transition their gender are now the first ones to really disallow it, and they're really changing their counseling and their therapy model. So I'm very hopeful for those countries. And again, I do agree with you that the U.S. is behind in that. And, you know, somebody here needs to stand up and say no a little bit louder. It's absolutely a problem. Gender, in our opinion, as Bible-believing followers of Christ, we believe that there is a biblical sexual ethic. We believe that there is a male and female set and chosen by God, not to be fooled around with. And when we allow children to believe that, oh, gender isn't real and I can be whoever I want, we're giving them license to believe that nothing's real and that nothing that God did for them is set in stone or was good. If my gender is wrong, then my gifts are wrong and my family is wrong and my everything is wrong. It's not wise to let kids believe that.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about kind of identity and purpose and meaning. And I think that this whole idea of gender identity is really interesting. When we kind of encourage kids to question their identity and really to remake it, how does that go, especially to your kind of research? I'm thinking of the book Five to Thrive, right? Where you talk a lot about how identity and kind of formed and how we kind of build those things. What does this do for kids when we just kind of challenge them or question them on maybe some fundamental realities that they've had introduced to them? And is there something missing when we look at this topic that is primary inside of their identity that maybe some people that are advocating gender questioning are missing with what identity is?
Oh, that's so interesting. Thousands of things that they're missing. So identity is rooted in security. So who can I trust is huge. If you want to influence your children's view of themselves, you must be someone they can trust. And unfortunately, we're allowing our children to trust their feelings. And we're sending them to people who say your feelings are real and go with the flow. And I could testify to how dangerous that would be in my own life. If I went with all my feelings, I'd weigh 200 pounds more than I weigh. And that's not a joke, because I like chocolate and I like onion rings, French fries, and a double bacon cheeseburger, all right? But I can't always go with my feelings because I know enough about my life and I want to live it well for the Lord. So good heavens. We also know in our model what we teach, this comes right out of the scripture, identity, who I am, leads to belonging, who wants me, which leads to purpose, who am I called to serve, why am I alive, and leads to my competence, what do I do well. So when a child's identity is false, not true, very narrow, they're not thinking about their intellectual identity, their emotional identity, their spiritual identity. They're just thinking about, I want to be a boy. Then it rocks their narrow, it limits their belonging. It'll rob them of purpose, and it will change what they value for their competence. Everything goes south.
So, Dr. Kathy, I think that this really does impact those that kind of build that fundamental reality for kids, parents and grandparents. When parents and grandparents kind of address this, it's often one of the scariest things I think that they can kind of encounter, especially right now, because of the different things that we're hearing, studies and what have you, that kind of come with this. And we're kind of told to adopt it whole hog and just kind of accept it. This is just the way that the world is today. What would you say to parents and grandparents? What encouragement would you give to them if their kids are questioning this, or if their kids' friends are questioning this?
I appreciate that. The data on suicide is what I hear from a lot of parents and grandparents about. They're very afraid that if they don't allow their child or grandchild to transition, that child will kill him or herself, because they've heard data like this from the Trevor Project, and their Trevor Project's very biased. They're going to give us data from the people they survey that's going to make their cause celebrated. So I want us to be very discerning here. What I want everyone to understand is that the suicide rate among 10 to 24-year-olds is, I think it's the second leading cause of death for 10 to 24-year-olds across the board is suicide. We have an epidemic in our country of sadness, anxiety, stress, and depression, isolation. Unfortunately, busy and overwhelmed parents who are not available to their kids. And I don't say that lightly. The education system that is crowded and hurried and turn the page, here's another test. We have got to do better at connecting with our kids, no matter what their gender, sexuality, belief system might be. And we must understand that they are looking for a quick fix to a problem that isn't even permanent. And the data is clear right now that the suicide rate is highest 7 or 8 years after transitioning, when these young people find out, I thought if I became a different gender, my life would be fine, and it's not. They have health problems. They are still dealing with mental health, stress that was not cured by a physical change. And so I want to encourage parents and grandparents who are nervous and fearful to make sure they're looking at real data, that they're talking to real people. Don't try to live this out alone. This is why we're here. But you also, I pray, would have friends and members of a peer group and a Bible study and hopefully a pastor who would walk with you if you're dealing with this personally.
What kind of outlook should they have then on this? I've often heard that it's important for parents and grandparents to have kind of a long game, but with that, no matter what, they're going to encounter this, right? So I have it with some friends of mine that, their kids are identifying as, caring or their friends have, same-sex partners that they spend time with, and they come home for Christmas, and they come home for Easter, and they come home for these different holidays. And the parents are kind of in this place of, we're walking through this long game. But is there a way to relate to our kids? And how would you say we can relate to our kids when this just feels like such a fundamental way that we, connect with adult children? My parents, connect with me through my grandkids many times, right? That's what draws us together. What do you do when that's not there? How do you connect with, adult kids who might be in this place where they're not living out that reality that you had dreamed for them when they were 5 or 6 years old?
Yeah, very carefully. Own your sadness, grieve well, pray, and you don't have to tell them that you're praying. Be available. What else can you talk about? There's more than gender. Do you still enjoy golf? So do I. What's your favorite course lately? Talk about things that you have in common with them. Bring up memories, not let me remind you of a good time in our life. Like, you don't have to say it that way, but talk about what you have in common. Talk about the hopes. All these people have hopes and dreams, aspirations, and goals for their lives. We can talk about a lot of things that don't have to be rooted in their choices for their gender or their sexual expression. And if that's all you talk about, all you think about, and all you fear, they're going to know that, and they will probably distance themselves from you. I also want to say, Wayne, with a lot of respect for our listeners, that this starts when kids are young. It starts when we say no to the no things when they're young, when we don't let them have everything they want because we know it's not healthy and good for them. And we teach them that boundaries are blessings when love is the goal. And trust our experience and trust that we love you well. And this is why we're going to say yes to this and no to that.
As Dr. Kathy was talking today, it reminded me of a passage coming out of John 1. I'm going to begin reading at verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. That's the glory of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace." That phrase that John writes here at the beginning of his gospel, grace upon grace, is something that really strikes me, especially when we talk about this topic specifically. It is really by God's grace that we have people in our lives that we care about. It's also by God's grace that those people whom we care about can feel the expression and the care, the love that we might have for them. And I think when we look at this topic, and especially as we read throughout John's gospel, but you could read throughout almost any place in scripture, the confusion seems to be insurmountable in many cases. And what we see within the way that God approaches that, but not just God, the church too, there's a simple, gentle love that comes out, a grace that kind of permeates and oftentimes infiltrates and breaks down confusion to bring, I would say, maybe enchantment. That idea of enchantment meaning really finding ourselves inside of the song, finding ourselves inside of the canto, if we want to use the Spanish form of that word. There's this reality that God invites us into this incredible story, and he gives us grace upon grace to stand there and to be in it. And as John writes, we find that grace upon grace comes from his Son. And I think pulling back, especially in some of these hard moments, and just simply loving well, being present in that brokenness, that's what Jesus did in John 1, coming down and making his dwelling among us. It's also what we're called to do in some really challenging and dark times. So we want to encourage you with that, give you courage for that moment. Be willing to step into the dark times and be present and be a simple light that shines and is grace upon grace in different moments and situations and circumstances. I want to thank you for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast in this daily segment, Facing the Dark. Dr. Kathy is getting ready to launch a new course in the month of April, and we're looking at how building character is stronger than building obedience for our kids. That character oftentimes leads to obedience, but it's actually something that guides kids as they're growing and becoming mature adults to have fortitude and resilience, to have a type of engagement with the cultural moment that isn't just obedient, but holds tightly to the characteristics and the ideas and really the image that God gives us. So we want to invite you to sign up for that. And you can do that by going to our website, celebratekids.com. I want to thank you for listening to the podcast today. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender, and we're really looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.